In 2019, a team of researchers ran a crocodile mummy from the temple complex at Kom Ombo through a synchrotron scanner, a machine capable of seeing through 3,000 years of resin and linen without unwrapping a single layer. What it found was a homicide. The animal's skull carried a single, precise fracture at the top of the head, the kind of wound inflicted by someone who had gotten close enough to strike downward without warning. The embalmers had known. Scan after scan showed the same pattern. The wound packed and disguised within hours of death. The body rushed into preservation before decomposition could set in. Evidence of violence sealed inside a linen-wrapped offering to the very god the animal was supposed to represent. Egypt's crocodile cult was never the gentle, sun-drenched image of priests hand-feeding a tame pet in a temple pool. Behind that image sat an operation built on organized killing, regional hatred, and, according to at least one Roman eyewitness, outright massacre. The god behind that violence was Sobek, and the reason Egyptians worshipped him instead of simply avoiding him is written into the Nile itself. Nile crocodiles were not a rare hazard. They lined riverbanks and irrigation canals across the entire length of the country. Ambush predators capable of dragging a grown man underwater in seconds. And anyone who farmed, fished, or drew water from the Nile lived within reach of one for their entire life. Adult Nile crocodiles regularly exceeded 5 meters in length in antiquity, before millennia of hunting reduced the species across most of its range. And a bull crocodile lurking motionless at a riverbank was, by design, almost invisible until the moment it struck. Villages built along canals and irrigation channels had no real option to relocate away from the danger, since the water itself was the reason those villages existed at all. The same current that watered a farmer's barley also carried the animals that could kill him while he stood in the shallows to check his fields. Egyptian religion did not generally worship what was gentle. It worshipped what was powerful, and it treated power itself, regardless of its temperament, as something that needed to be placated rather than defeated. Sobek's name likely derives from an Egyptian root meaning to impregnate or to unite, tying the crocodile's raw physical force to fertility and the life-giving flood of the Nile as much as to death. But the underlying logic was transactional. A farmer who honored Sobek was not asking the god to be kind. He was asking the animal that killed his neighbors to look elsewhere. This is a pattern that recurs across Egyptian religion more broadly, since gods like Sekhmet, the lion-headed bringer of plague, were worshipped under nearly identical logic. Appeasement of a force too dangerous to ignore, rather than devotion to a force admired for its virtue. Worship of Sobek did not stop ordinary Egyptians from fearing individual crocodiles, and surviving magical texts make that fear explicit. Protective spells against crocodile attack appear repeatedly in Egyptian magical papyri, recited over amulets meant to be worn while crossing water, or carved directly onto small stelae set up near dangerous crossing points, their wording calling on Sobek himself, or occasionally a rival god, to restrain the animal's jaws before they could close. The contradiction embedded in this practice went largely unremarked in the surviving sources. A farmer might invoke Sobek's protection against Sobek's own living incarnation in the same breath, treating the god as simultaneously the danger and the only available defense against it. Sobek's worship reaches back further into Egyptian religion than almost any other animal cult in the historical record. References to the god appear in the pyramid texts inscribed inside royal burial chambers by the late Old Kingdom, around the 24th century BCE, where Sobek is invoked in passages describing the king's power and virility rather than menace alone. Evidence that the crocodile's symbolic value had already been fixed in Egyptian theology for generations before those texts were carved. One especially blunt passage from the pyramid texts identifies the deceased king directly with the crocodile god, describing him as emerging from the waters with the same terrifying suddenness the animal itself was known for. A literary image that only works if the audience already understood exactly how a crocodile attack looked and felt. Egyptologists have identified Sobek imagery on amulets and seals reaching back even earlier, into the pre-dynastic period, before Egypt's unification around 3100 BCE. Though the god's precise role in that much earlier period remains difficult to reconstruct, given how little textual evidence survives from before writing itself was fully developed. Local cult centers grew up wherever crocodile populations were thickest and most dangerous, particularly along the marshy edges of the Faiyum Depression, southwest of modern Cairo, a natural lake-fed basin that offered exactly the slow-moving water crocodiles favored, and along stretches of the Nile near Thebes and Ombos in Upper Egypt. Early shrines were modest structures, often little more than a walled enclosure around a pool where a resident crocodile could be observed and fed, staffed by a small number of local priests whose primary religious function was keeping the animal calm enough that visitors could approach without being killed. What began as scattered local shrines tending a genuinely feared local predator would, over the following 1,000 years, grow into one of the best-funded religious institutions in Egypt. Its wealth and reach expanding in direct proportion to how thoroughly the state chose to associate itself with the god. Sobek was rarely worshipped in isolation from Egypt's wider pantheon. By the Middle Kingdom, he had been merged in various local traditions with Ra, the sun god, producing a composite figure worshipped as Sobek Ra at several major temples. A theological pairing that let priests present the crocodile not merely as a predator to be appeased, but as an aspect of the same solar power that governed the rest of creation. This kind of merger was common practice in Egyptian religion, a way of absorbing a fearsome local cult into the national theology, rather than letting it remain an isolated, purely regional superstition. And it gave Sobek's priesthood a claim to cosmic significance well beyond the reach of any single crocodile-infested canal. That growth accelerated sharply under Amenemhat III, who ruled during the 12th dynasty from roughly 1860 to 1814 BCE and undertook one of the most ambitious land reclamation projects in Egyptian history, damming and channeling the Faiyum's water system to convert marshland into farmland on a scale no earlier king had attempted. The project involved a network of canals and a regulating structure controlling the flow between the Nile and Lake Meris, the Faiyum's natural lake. Engineering sophisticated enough that Greek visitors centuries later still described it with something close to awe. The project tied Amenemhat III's own reputation directly to Sobek's domain, since the god of the crocodile-infested waters was, by extension, the god of the very engineering project, turning those waters into the kingdom's newest breadbasket. And a king who wanted credit for that transformation had every incentive to be seen as Sobek's favored servant rather than his rival. Amenemhat III built extensively at Shedet, the Faiyum's central city, which Greek visitors later renamed Crocodilopolis for exactly the reason its name implies, and constructed a sprawling mortuary complex at nearby Hawara that Herodotus, writing centuries afterward, claimed surpassed even the pyramids in scale and complexity. A building the Greeks came to call the Labyrinth for its reported maze of interconnected chambers and courtyards. Herodotus wrote that he was permitted to see only the upper level of the structure, since the lower level, reportedly containing the tombs of kings and sacred crocodiles together, was closed to visitors by the priests who guarded it. A detail that, whether entirely accurate or partly exaggerated for a Greek audience hungry for Egyptian mystery, at minimum confirms the building's reputation for scale and secrecy had already solidified within a few centuries of its construction. His own daughter, Sobek Neferu, took a throne name honoring the crocodile god directly, when she became one of Egypt's rare female pharaohs after her brother's line ended without a male heir around 1806 BCE, evidence that by the close of the 12th dynasty, Sobek's cult had moved from regional shrine to a source of royal legitimacy itself. Invoked by name in the titles of the ruler who sat on Egypt's throne, no later Egyptian king took the crocodile god's name as directly as Sobek-Neferu did. None needed to. By her reign, Sobek's association with the throne was already assumed rather than announced. The clearest documented picture of Sobek worship in daily practice comes not from Egyptian sources, but from Greek and Roman visitors writing more than 1,000 years after Amenemhat III's reign. When the cult reached its most theatrical form, by the 3rd century BCE, under the Ptolemaic kings who renamed Crocodilopolis as Arsenoi in honor of the dynasty's queens, priests at the city's temple maintained a single living crocodile as the physical embodiment of the god. An animal Greek sources call Petsuchos, meaning roughly he who belongs to Sobek. This sacred crocodile did not merely sit in a pool waiting to be admired. It was fitted with ornaments, kept in a specially maintained enclosure, and fed on a regular schedule by priests trained specifically for the task. A role that presumably came with real occupational risk, given the animal's nature, regardless of how tame decades of hand-feeding might have made it. The Roman geographer Strabo, visiting Arsenoi around 24 BCE, left a first-hand account of the ritual, guided by a local priest carrying flatbread, roasted meat, and a jug of wine mixed with honey. Strabo watched the sacred animal lounging at the water's edge while 2 attendants forced its jaws open and fed it by hand. First the bread, then the meat, then the honeyed wine poured directly down its throat, while Strabo himself stood close enough to witness the entire procedure firsthand. Strabo's account carries the tone of a curious tourist rather than a devotee. Noting the ritual with the same detached interest, he applied to Egypt's other unusual customs. But he does not describe the moment as safe, only as successfully completed. Herodotus, writing roughly 4 centuries earlier, described a similar practice at other cult centers. Tame crocodiles fitted with earrings of glass and gold, bracelets around their front legs, fed on consecrated food, and mummified with full funerary honors when they died. At which point a newly selected animal took up the same sacred role, chosen and installed through a process no surviving Egyptian source fully explains. What replaced Petsuchos when one incarnation died is not recorded in enough detail to say. Whether the selection process involved any test of the animal's temperament, or whether any crocodile large enough and conveniently available simply inherited the role. Multiple Faiyum towns appear to have kept their own resident sacred crocodiles simultaneously, each claiming its own animal as a genuine embodiment of the god, which meant Sobek was, in a literal sense, worshipped in several bodies at once across the region, rather than through any single living incarnation, the way some ancient sources imply. What Herodotus also recorded, and what later events would prove was no minor detail, is that this reverence was never universal. Crocodiles were sacred at Thebes and throughout the Faiyum, but in other regions, especially around Elephantine in the far south, Egyptians hunted crocodiles, ate their meat, and held nothing sacred about them at all. This was not a simple difference of local custom, nome by nome. Egypt's 42 administrative provinces each maintained their own patron deities and sacred animals, and a creature treated as a living god in one nome could be treated as ordinary game in the neighboring one, sometimes only a short distance downriver. Herodotus even recorded the hunting method used in regions where crocodiles held no sanctity at all. A hunter baited a hook with a chunk of pork, let a live pig squeal and thrash on the near bank to draw the animal's attention, then hauled the hooked crocodile ashore and clubbed it to death once it tired itself fighting the line. A practical, almost business-like description of killing the same species that priests a short distance away were feeding wine and honey cake by hand. The gnome centered on Ombos, close to modern Kom Ombo, stood firmly in the crocodile-worshipping camp. Its temple built as a rare dual sanctuary, honoring both Sobek and the falcon god Horus side by side. Tentyra, modern Dendera, stood just as firmly against it. Its own patron deities, holding no place for the crocodile at all and its people, according to Roman-era sources, treating crocodile hunting as something close to civic pride. The temple built at Ombos during the Ptolemaic period, roughly 180 to 47 BCE, physically encodes this tension in stone. Kom Ombo is the only known Egyptian temple built as a perfectly symmetrical double sanctuary, its entire floor plan duplicated down the center line, so that Sobek and Horus each received an identical entrance, an identical hypostyle hall lined with matching columns, and an identical inner sanctuary. Mirror images of each other separated only by a shared central axis. Nothing about this symmetry was accidental. Two powerful gods sharing unequal space at a single site risked the appearance that one had been favored over the other. An imbalance. Egyptian temple builders went to unusual lengths to avoid here specifically, which suggests the priests who designed Kom Ombo understood exactly how volatile the politics of competing sacred animals could become, even when both gods nominally belonged to the same pantheon. Sobek was far from the only animal god capable of triggering this kind of local contradiction. Egyptians in some regions revered cats as manifestations of the goddess Bastet, while other communities kept no particular reverence for them at all. The ram was sacred at Elephantine, even while crocodiles there were hunted freely, a reminder that sacred animal in Egyptian religion was never a single, nationwide category, but a patchwork of overlapping and sometimes contradictory local loyalties stitched together under one royal government. For most of Egyptian history, this patchwork of belief caused little more than mutual bewilderment, the kind of regional joke one gnome might make about another's strange local customs. But devotion this intense, wherever it existed, came with a cost attached, one that fell on the animals themselves long before it ever fell on the people who worshipped or hated them. By the time Ptolemaic and Roman-era pilgrims were visiting Faiyum temples in large numbers, demand for crocodile mummies as votive offerings had turned worship of the god into an industrial-scale operation, one that treated the animal Egyptians called sacred as raw material for a religious supply chain. Excavations at Tebtunis, a Faiyum town southwest of Crocodilopolis, uncovered a dedicated crocodile necropolis containing thousands of mummified animals, ranging from newly hatched young, barely larger than a hand, to adults exceeding 5 meters in length, alongside physical evidence of hatcheries and breeding pens built specifically to guarantee a steady supply. Rather than relying on whatever wild crocodiles happened to die naturally near a given temple, eggs collected from nesting sites along the Faiyum's lake edge were incubated under controlled conditions, and hatchlings were raised in enclosed pools until they reached a size worth mummifying. A production timeline temple administrators could plan around rather than leave to chance, turning what began as reverence for an unpredictable wild predator into a managed livestock operation with religious packaging. Kom Ombo's own temple complex has yielded roughly 300 crocodile mummies from its associated cemetery, several of which modern imaging has confirmed died from deliberate blunt trauma rather than age, illness, or natural predation. The pattern uncovered by the 2019 synchrotron study was not an isolated case. It was standard practice. Crocodiles killed on demand, embalmed within hours to hide the method, and sold into a religious marketplace that had little apparent interest in whether its votive offerings had died naturally or been produced specifically for sale. the embalming process itself. Once a body arrived at the workshop, followed a fairly consistent sequence across sites. The corpse dried using natron salt to draw out moisture and prevent decay. The body cavity packed and treated with resin, and the whole animal wrapped in layered linen bandages, sometimes in elaborate geometric patterns, for wealthier patrons willing to pay a premium for a more decorative offering. Smaller crocodiles and hatchlings were sometimes wrapped dozens at a time into a single bundle, a practice that maximized the number of nominal offerings a pilgrim's silver could purchase without requiring a correspondingly large supply of full-grown adults. That same commercial pressure produced outright fraud. Some mummy bundles examined in modern collections have turned out to contain no crocodile at all, or only partial remains packed out with mud. Reeds or other animal bone shaped roughly into a crocodile's outline beneath the wrappings. Evidence that at least some suppliers were willing to defraud pilgrims outright once demand outpaced the available supply of real animals. A pilgrim purchasing a wrapped offering to present at a shrine had no practical way to check what was actually inside it, which meant the religious economy built around Sobek's sanctity ran, at least in part, on the assumption that nobody buying a god's mummified likeness would ever think to ask. Running an operation at this scale required a workforce well beyond the small band of priests who had once tended a single pool in an early shrine. Temple records from the Ptolemaic and Roman periods describe a hierarchy of specialists attached to major crocodile cult centers, priests responsible for the living sacred animal, separate staff who managed the hatcheries and breeding stock, embalmers trained specifically in reptile preservation rather than human mummification, and administrators who tracked temple income from the sale of votive offerings, land rents, and pilgrim donations. Papyri recovered from Tebtunis include mundane administrative correspondence about crocodile feed allotments and temple expenses alongside religious texts. Evidence that by the Roman period, running a crocodile god's cult was as much a logistics operation as a spiritual one, staffed by people whose daily concerns looked closer to inventory management than to devotion. This was violence carried out quietly, disguised inside linen wrappings and temple account books, the kind of institutional brutality that left no eyewitness testimony behind, because there was no single dramatic moment for anyone to witness. The other kind of violence connected to Sobek's cult was witnessed directly by a Roman writer, and it happened not to a crocodile, but to a man. The Roman satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century CE, describes a violent clash between these two neighboring towns in Upper Egypt, Ombos, where the crocodile was worshipped, and Tentira, where it was despised and actively hunted. According to Juvenal's account, the two towns had nursed a long-standing hatred of each other's religion for generations, each certain the other's god was an abomination unworthy of the Nile's favor. During a festival at Ombos, the account claims a crowd from Tentira used the celebration as cover to attack, and in the chaos that followed, at least one man from Ombos was caught while trying to flee, brought down, and reportedly torn apart and eaten by the mob. An act of cannibalism Juvenal presents as the natural endpoint of religious hatred pushed past reason. Juvenal's telling lingers on the physical details deliberately, describing the victim's body divided among the attackers until nothing recognizable remained. A level of graphic specificity clearly intended to shock a Roman readership already primed to view Egyptian animal worship as bizarre and faintly ridiculous. Juvenal was a satirist, not a historian, and his account should be read with the same caution any single ancient source deserves. Exaggeration and moral point scoring for rhetorical effect were standard tools of his genre, and no independent Egyptian or Roman administrative record confirms the cannibalism details specifically. But Roman-era papyri from the same general period do independently confirm ongoing tension and occasional violence between neighboring Egyptian nomes over precisely this kind of religious divide. Disputes serious enough that Roman officials periodically had to intervene to keep local feuds over sacred animals from disrupting tax collection and public order. Most historians who study the period treat the core outline of the Ombos incident, if not necessarily every gruesome detail juvenal supplies, as reflecting a real and violent conflict rather than pure literary invention. Whatever actually happened at Ombos, the fact that a Roman writer could present crocodile-fueled religious massacre as a believable, recognizable type of Egyptian news event says something on its own about how seriously this divide was taken by people living through it. Rome generally tolerated Egypt's local religions without much interference, so long as they did not threaten tax revenue or public order. A riot serious enough to reach a Roman satirist's pen in the capital had, at minimum, reached a scale someone in the imperial bureaucracy thought was worth knowing about. No surviving record states what became of Ombos and Tentira's feud after the incident Juvenal described, or whether the two towns' hostility ever genuinely cooled. What is certain is that Sobek's cult did not end in a single dramatic collapse of the kind that story might suggest. It faded the way most of Egypt's old religion did, as the spread of Christianity through the Roman and then Byzantine administration steadily cut off the funding. Priesthoods and temple infrastructure that animal worship depended on, a process that accelerated sharply after the Emperor Theodosius ordered pagan temples across the empire closed near the end of the 4th century CE. Without state subsidy or an organized priesthood to maintain the sacred pools and hatcheries, the elaborate infrastructure supporting cult centers like Crocodilopolis and Teptinus simply stopped being renewed. And within a few generations, the practice of raising, feeding, and mummifying crocodiles for religious purposes had ended across Egypt for good. The wild crocodiles that had once been sacred, feared, hunted, and fought over in equal measure remained in the Nile, regardless of what humans believed about them, indifferent to the collapse of a religion built entirely around managing their reputation. Kom-Ombo's dual temple to Sobek and Horus survived the centuries that followed better than most of Egypt's animal cult sites, its stone walls outlasting the religion they were built to serve. And the crocodile cemetery beside it kept its mummies sealed and largely undisturbed until modern excavation began in earnest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Today, those mummies fill a dedicated museum at Kom-Ombo, examined periodically with the same kind of imaging technology that exposed the skull fracture in 2019. And each new scan adds another name to a growing list of animals killed to order for a god whose worshippers, in at least one Roman town on the Nile, were willing to kill and eat each other over exactly how sacred that god actually was. Researchers continue to run additional mummies from Kom-Ombo, Teptunis, and other Faiyum sites through modern scanning equipment, and each survey so far has turned up further evidence of the same pattern: hunted animals, disguised wounds, and a religious economy that valued the appearance of a natural sacred death over the fact of one. Tourists visiting Kom-Ombo today walk the same stone courtyards Strabo and Herodotus once described secondhand. Past reliefs of Sobek carved into walls that have outlasted every priesthood that ever served him, and into a museum built specifically to hold the crocodile mummies excavated from the surrounding sand. None of the animals on display there can be verified as having died of old age. The stone at Kom-Ombo has stood in place for over 2,000 years, largely silent on what its own priests actually did behind the temple walls. The crocodiles inside it, scan by scan, have not stayed silent nearly as long.